Assalamu alaikum. Today we will discuss about Mendelian inheritance, about Mendel's law of inheritance, what is Mendel's law of inheritance and where it applies, and what is the limitation of Mendel's law of inheritance. As all science community knows, Gregor John Mendel, born in 1822 and died in 1884. He was an Austrian monk. He worked in a church as Austrian monk, and he experimented with pea plants that planted in the garden of that church in which he was working as monk. He thought that heritable factors that later named as genes retain their individuality generation after generation. That heritable factor pass on from one generation to another generation. Principles of genetics were developed in the mid 19th century, experimented with pea plants by crossing various strains and observing the characters of their offspring. He planted many pea plants and experimented on that pea plants and observed many characteristics of their offsprings. Gregor Mendel is the father of modern genetics. Due to his basic work on genetics, he was named as the father of modern genetics. Here we will discuss about Mendel's experiments. Gregor Mendel studied inheritance of 7 traits in pea plants, and that traits are pea pod shape, pea color, pea flower shape, pod color, and the shape of pea seeds. And that traits were characterized into 2 categories. For one is known as dominance characteristics, and the second is known as recessive characteristic. He proposed similar but separate inheritable characteristics, one from each parent, later to be called genes. That characters that were different from one another from each parent, that character were later known as factors, and factor were named as genes. The unit of inheritance are alleles of genes. Why the unit of inheritance are alleles of genes? Genes alleles, why known as inheritance units? Traits are controlled by alleles because alleles control traits of any characteristics. And what are allele? Allele are alternative form of a gene found on homologous chromosome at a particular gene locus. What is gene locus? The position of a gene on chromosome is known as gene locus, and gene has alleles that are alternative form of a gene. The dominant allele and that alternative form of a gene are of 2 types. One is dominant allele and the second is recessive allele. The dominant allele that masks the expression of the other allele is known as dominant allele, and the recessive allele that masked by the dominant allele. Genotype refers to the alleles an individual receives at fertilization. Genotype means that appearance of an individual, that individual alleles that receives at fertilization, that appear in genotype, that appears is known as genotype. Genotype may be homozygous or heterozygous. As we name genes as flower color gene, and we named one white color flower as dominant allele and the black color flower, for example, as recessive allele. If so dominant allele, if white color flower, that is dominant allele, if it has genotype written in capital words, that is known as that it is homozygous and are same alphabets. Whereas if the genotype is expressed in small letters, and then it is known as recessive allele. And if the alleles genotype is different, that two different alphabets are representing the genotype of an allele, then it is heterozygous. Homozygous, an organism has two identical alleles at a gene locus. If similar alleles are present at two gene locus, then they are called homozygous. And if an organism has two different alleles at a gene locus, then it is heterozygous. Phenotype. The physical appearance of an individual is called phenotype. Genotype is the actual form of allele, and phenotype is the apparent form of an allele of that it appear in individual, as flower color, flower shape, pod color, pod shape, pea seed shape, etc. Now moving on toward dominant and recessive. A dominant allele is represented by capital letter. It is always expressed when present. ये हमेशा ही एक्सप्रेस होना होता है इसने एज कैपिटल बी और कैपिटल बी स्मॉल बी. व्हेन इट इज़ प्रेजेंट it will express itself. That is why it is called dominant allele. Whether there is another recessive allele is present with it, but its characteristics that make it unique from the recessive allele is that it will express where it is present. A recessive allele is represented by lower case letters. It is only expressed when an individual has two, one from mom and one from dad, as to small b only. Genotype and phenotype. A genotype is the genetic makeup of an individual expressed in letters as capital B, capital B, capital B, small b, small. These are forms of genotype. Phenotype is the physical appearance of an individual determined by his or her genotype as black, brown, short, tall, etc. Punnett square. By making Punnett square, we can find the genotype of a gene. Punnett square used to show the mating of two parents and the possible offspring they can produce. Mendel observed 7 pea plant traits which are known as flower color, purple or white, flower position, axial or terminal, stem length, tall or dwarf, seed shape, round or wrinkled, seed color, yellow or green, pod shape, inflated or constricted, pod color, green or yellow. These all are two different forms where there is no form of incomplete dominance by Lucky. This was a lack of rigor Mendel, that there was no form of co-dominance or incomplete dominance. These all are cases of complete dominance and recessiveness. Mendel's 7 characteristics are shown there. There are purple color and white color flowers. Axial mean flower position is at the axis, and the terminal position mean the flower are present at the at the tip of the stem. Seed color may be yellow, may be green. Seed shape may be round, may be wrinkled. Pod shape may be inflated, may be constricted. Pod color may be green, may be yellow. Stem length may be tall, may be dwarf. True breeding plants. What are true breeding plants? True breeding plants make offspring that are same as the parents every time. True breeding plants are those plants that make the offspring same as the parents. From his experimental data, Mendel deduced that an organism has two genes, means alleles, for each inherited characteristics. Each characteristic is controlled by genes, and genes have alleles. So actually alleles are the basic unit of inheritance. One's characteristics comes from each parent. One characteristic received from mother and other characteristics received from father. Mendel deduced the underlying principles of genetics from these patterns: dominance, segregation, independent assortment. This table show the Mendel's experimental data, and in the next slide, Mendel's law of dominance. There we will explain what is Mandala of Dominance. If your two alleles are different, one is heterozygous, and it means capital B and small b are two different alleles. The one is dominant allele and other is recessive allele present in a gene's alleles. The trait associated with only one of these will be visible while the other will be hidden, because there is also present a dominant allele along with the recessive allele. So where the allele is present, the recessive will be masked by the effect of dominant allele. Law of dominance in a hybrid union. Hybrid is a combination of two different parents. The allele which expresses itself phenotypically is the dominant allele, while the other allele which fails to express itself phenotypically is recessive allele. The hybrid individuals show phenotypically only the dominant character. The law of dominance is often described as Mendel's first law of inheritance. Always remember that Mendel's law of inheritance is also known as law of dominance. Means the dominant character will show itself and the recessive character will be hidden by the effect of dominant character. There are showing a homozygous tall and heterozygous homozygous dwarf. They will produce two heterozygous means hybrid. They will produce hybrid combinations, and hybrid will produce different ratios of homozygous and heterozygous. With the with homozygous genotype and heterozygous genotype. Next, here is the Punnett square of Mendel's law of inheritance, and second law, Mendel's law of segregation. A normal mean somatic cell has two variant alleles for a Mendelian trait. Means it doesn't mean that every somatic cells has two variant alleles. It means that only Mendelian trait follows this rule that normal cells has two variants alleles. A gamete, sperm, egg, pollen, ovule contain one allele randomly chosen from the two somatic alleles. Like if you have one allele for brown eyes, capital B, and one for blue eyes, small b, somatic cells have capital B, small b, and each gametes will carry one of capital B or small b chosen randomly. Law of segregation, the separation of alleles into the separate gametes. Law of segregation says that alleles separate individually from gametes. The law of segregation states each individual has two factors for each trait. The factors segregate separate during the formation of gametes. Factors segregate during the formation of gametes. Each individual has two factors that may be dominant and recessive, and dominant and recessive will segregate at the time of gamete formation individually, independently. Each gamete contain only one factor from each pair of factors, and each gamete, whether it is egg or sperm, will contain one factor from each pair of factors. Fertilization gives each new individual two factors for each trait, and then fertilization occurs. There two haploid gametes that have haploid alleles, single characters. When they will unite at the time of fertilization, they will form paired alleles and control a specific trait. Here is monohybrid cross. What is monohybrid cross? What happen when two breeding plants with two distinct forms of a trait crossed? Progeny means offspring show only one form of the trait. The observed trait is called dominant and the masked trait is called the recessive. When we are looking at one trait such as eye color or height, when we are studying at a time only one trait, that cross is known as monohybrid cross. Parents are called P, parental generation. Children are called F1, first filial generation. Grandchildren are called F2, second filial generation. Law of independent assortment. When a hybrid or a polyhybrid form gametes, dihybrid or polyhybrid form a gamete. Each gamete receives one allele from each allelic pair. and the assortment of alleles of different traits during the gamete formation is totally independent of their original combination in the parents. Each allele of any one pair is free to combine with any allele from each of the remaining pairs during the formation for gametes. This is called law of independent assortment of characteristics. It is also referred to as Mendel's third law of heredity. First law was Mendel's law of dominance. Second law was Mendel's law of inheritance. Mendel's law of segregation. Mendel's law of segregation, and the third law is Mendel's law of independent assortment. Each allele of any one pair is free to combine with any allele from each of the remaining pairs during the formation of the gametes. It is not depend upon the remaining alleles that they will go. One allele will go on with that specific allele. It is independent. It depend upon allele's fate that it will come toward a specific allele, or it will go individually. It is referred to as third law of heredity. The principle of independent assortment was explained by Mendel with the help of dihybrid cross. And the dihybrid cross, what is dihybrid cross? A cross where at a time two traits are discussing and where two traits are under discussion are called dihybrid cross, involving characters of cotyledon color, yellow or round, and seed shape round or wrinkled. Mendel, there are two characteristics that are under discussion: cotyledon color and seed shape. Mendel crossed a true breeding variety of pea having yellow cotyledon and round seed with another true breeding variety having green cotyledons and wrinkled seeds. Thus, the yellow round parent has genotype and green wrinkled parents have recessive genotype. Since each parent is homozygous for both characters, color and shape, and each will produce one type of gametes, the parents will produce all type of gametes, and they will produce all type of gametes. All F1 hybrid resulting from the fusion of these gametes would be double heterozygous with capital Y, small y, capital R, small r genotype and appears yellow round. This indicated that in dihybrid cross, also in each pair the allele behaved exactly in the same manner as monohybrid cross. Both the dominant capital Y and capital R expressed themselves in F1, while both and recessive alleles remained hidden. Types of gamete formed by F1. That's all we have discussed in the previous slides. So I think you understand how complete the topic. So goodbye till the next video.